Stability is really what we are after when we look at HRV. For a very long time, it has been pushed the idea that higher is better, more stable is better. It's not about HRV going up, it's about, being within that normal range, which means that you stress the body and then it bounces back, and when you measure again, it's again where it should be.
If you're enjoying the show and want to take the next step in your training, join our newsletter and receive a free 4-week sample training plan. Head on over to uphillathlete.com/letsgo, and once you sign up, you'll instantly get a link to try out some of our most popular training plans. It's a great way to get a feel for how we train our athletes for big mountain goals. Check it out at uphillathlete.com/letsgo. That's uphillathlete.com/LETSGO.
My guest today is a scientist who has arguably done more than anyone to move heart rate variability out of the lab and into the real world. Dr. Marco Altini holds a PhD in data science and has built a remarkable academic resume. He's a guest lecturer at Vrije Universiteit in Amsterdam, a data scientist, an advisor for Aura, and has published over 50 peer-reviewed papers on physiology and health. He's also the founder of the HRV for Training platform. But the reason I wanted to speak to Marco was not so much his software, it was more because of his philosophy. In a world where wearables are trying to always sell you a green light or readiness score to run your life and your training, Marco has been a voice of restraint. He has been a data scientist who really understands how HRV works, telling us that if you wake up feeling great, but your watch says you're tired, you should trust yourself, not the machine. He's also a serious athlete himself. He qualified for the Boston Marathon. He's done ultras, and he treats his own body like kind of a walking laboratory. In fact, I've been reading along with his Substack, where he spent the last few months strictly kind of manipulating his carbohydrate intake to see if he could force his own metabolism to be more flexible and burn more fat, proving that even for a genius data scientist, the hunger knock is still a real thing. Marco Altini, welcome to the Uphill Athlete podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Steve. Real pleasure to be here.
Well, thank you. As I was saying before the show, you've had a lot of influence on us as a group of coaches. And I think that this voice of reason has been a big reason for that. And, the wearables industry has been obsessed with this idea of a readiness score, a watch or device that tells you your body battery is 80% charged. And you've been pretty vocal that these aggregated scores can be very misleading. And can you help me understand why a single readiness number may or may not be scientifically flawed?
Yeah, for sure. I think there's a topic that's been close to my heart for a while. I'll say that in principle, what they do, let's say the companies developing these scores, kind of makes sense. Like, even if it could come from a positive approach even to the whole story, like not trying to, trick the user in any way, of course, but trying to help them.
Yes.
And, it's a simple idea. Like, we have many signals, we aggregate them, and then you don't have to look at all the individual things. You don't need to be an expert in your sleep stages, in your HRV or resting heart rate, in your training behavior, in all sorts of things that are included in this score. And we just guide you this way. But I think eventually what happens is that these scores do us a bit of a disservice, because especially as athletes or people that are really interested in their training and their body is responding to their training, right? Am I getting better? Am I capable of assimilating more stress today, which is why we started developing these tools, right? When we put everything together, we give maybe the false impression that we are providing more information, but we are actually, I think, diluting that information. For example, if I have a negative readiness score today, and that comes from my behavior, not my physiological response, because everything is together. And the model makes assumptions, right? There is this idea that is tracking you, is personalized to you. But in reality, there are broad generalizations and assumptions that are made for the score to exist. For example, did you do a lot more physical activity than you normally do? Then you must be less ready, right? Your score must be lower. You must be less recovered, right? It is a simple deterministic thing. It's not really about how you responded. It's just more exercise means less readiness. And similarly, less sleep means less readiness. But the obviously is a complex biological system. It's not so simple. Maybe you can take 2-3 nights with poor sleep. And of course, you don't want to make that chronic. So the behavior matters. But it does not mean that on those days you cannot perform or you cannot assimilate more stress. So I think
Mhm.
eventually, especially as athletes, we might be interested in looking at our resting physiology. As you said, I spent many years developing tools and looking at this data. I believe the data is useful, but I think it is more useful to look at the resting physiology data, resting heart rate variability in response to our behavior. So using behavior as context, more than aggregating everything together and making again the assumption that you can determine what is the state of the body, because we cannot do that. And I think that also has other implications, because if we look at HRV, we could also talk to an athlete as a coach and explain what that is and why we look at it, and also its limitations. While the idea
Mhm.
of the recovery or readiness scores is indeed that it puts everything together, and as such, there is sort of no limitation, right? It's a comprehensive score of how you feel. But then we know, for example, that the main limiter for most athletes in endurance sports is probably on a given day muscular soreness, right? If we did a hard session yesterday, then we might be sore and unable to do another one today, even if our resting physiology is perfectly normal. And those kind of things, for example, from at a muscular point of view, cannot be captured by any of these technologies that are available today and easy to use. So it's just something that is part of the equation. And as a coach or as an athlete, you need to keep in mind, of course, and that's why we periodize training and plan, hard days, easy days. Obviously, there's that component is always present in our mind, but it's not tracked by the device. So I think, again, the compound score, the readiness recovery score, hides also these limitations of the technology. And the people expect that those things can also be tracked, but they cannot. So I think we are
Mhm.
just
Mhm.
better off, breaking it down again and looking at the individual components and looking at the objective data and then looking at the behavior. And then, of course, there's always the subjective component that, in my view, and I guess also your view, is one of the key components, but that doesn't fit the rhetoric of the tool automates everything and you don't have to do anything. So you don't even, fill in a questionnaire or anything like that before getting the score, because like the score knows your body better than you, which of course is not the case.
So what I'm hearing you say too is that, and we've been talking about readiness score, and we're also going to talk about heart rate variability, and they're related, but they're two different things. I want to clarify that. So let's dial in a little more tightly on HRV. Why is HRV a response to stress more than a predictor of performance? And can you kind of unpack that? I think that this is kind of one of the core misunderstandings of heart variability. And yeah, can you help us understand how that works?
Yeah. So heart rate variability, if we measure it at the right time, which I think is important, because at the beginning
Okay.
this was taken for granted, but right now there's tools that measure it all the time and extrapolate what could be done at a certain times to 24/7, and also that relationship doesn't really exist and the tool cannot be used that way. But let's say we measure at the right time, and that typically means,
Can we pause there? What is the right time? I
yeah,
gotta know.
yeah. So the right time, I would say either first thing in the morning or with some different considerations throughout the night. So the way wearables do it automatically as you sleep, I think is also fine. What differs there is that, of course, you measure earlier, while in the morning you measure after the restorative effect of sleep. So in my opinion, it is a better time for that reason, because
Okay.
you give more time to the body to recover from the stressors of the previous day. And also you include the sleep as a positive if the sleep went well stressor, or otherwise if disrupted or anything like that, you still capture your data first thing in the morning after that. And also measuring in the morning allows you to measure in a different body position, which I think also is key, especially for endurance athletes. So to measure when you're sitting up, the body is slightly more stressed, so to speak, and that makes the measurement more sensitive to stress. So changes that while you are sleeping are very small, that typically are the changes due to training and even going at altitude and things like that. So sometimes it's more subtle changes, especially for good athletes. And if you sit up and then measure shortly after, let's say within a minute, those changes are amplified. So then the measurement becomes more useful because you see these things better. While the night measurements, you will certainly see if you're sick, but that's, an enormous stressor that hopefully you're not facing very frequently, right? So if you want to really balance training and things like that, then again, the morning might be a better time. So let's say we measure HRV at those times. What the data reflects is our capacity to assimilate stress in that moment, let's say, so for the day ahead as we plan training, and not necessarily our capacity to actually perform. So, and that is indeed a common misconception, like in the past, especially, I think a lot of people thought with a low HRV, low typically means higher stress, right? So it's a negative thing. So with a low HRV, you would have trouble executing the training. But that is not really the case. And we've seen these quite a few studies also, typically in the world of, let's say, HRV guided training, which means that, you have two groups of people. One is doing some form of periodization and the other group is doing the same. But then the periodization is slightly adjusted on a day-to-day basis depending on the HRV data. So that's why it's HRV guided. So what you see eventually is that it's not as much about what you can do, but it's about how much you can assimilate of the workout to get better over time, which is the goal of training. So if you have a low HRV on race day, it doesn't matter because you are racing, right? Then you will take, time to recover and so on. But then during a training block, it seems favorable to not add stress on a body that is already stressed, because then we can execute the training, but then we will not get better. So it's sort of useless to do it. And
Yeah.
even there, I think it's important to understand that the data reflects many different things, because HRV is just a marker of stress, of our stress response. And, it could be just the evening before you ate something that, didn't go well with you, and you'll have a bit of suppression. It's nothing to worry about. So I don't think we need to be very reactive, like every suppression we need to change the training and things like that. And also research has reflected that, like in the past, that was the approach. Well, now typically you look at the moving average, so a week basically of data with respect to what is considered your normal, and your normal is typically built over 1 to 2 months, so it's a broader range. And if your weekly average goes below your normal, then a change is implemented. But of course, for a weekly average to go below your normal, it takes a couple of bad days. So you're not reacting to any change. But then if you do have a couple of bad days, then maybe it's a good idea to make a small adjustments and wait, so that things renormalize before you add additional stress. So I think that is a bit the principle behind it, and how it is used today.
And I mean, that's the principle behind coaching. I mean, there's so many, times I've told people I can give, 20 athletes the same workout and all going to it's going to have a different effect on each of them. And that's what we do as coaches every day is, look at the athlete in the morning, get the kind of subjective report, look at the data, and then say, okay, yeah, I think you can absorb this much stress today or that much stress today. I'm talking about training stress here. But I mean, the other stresses of life are also relevant, right? Like you need to be aware of. And HRV is trying to pick up on all of those. And then, the modeling you're doing is trying to say, okay, this is how this relates to how we up or down regulate the training stimulus. And I think that's exactly the way a coach's mind works. And I think that's really one of the strengths of this approach is that it is trying to replicate a human knowledge worker process, if you will, to sort of like collect all the data, look at the plan, make an adjustment to the plan, and look at this sort of over not just days but weeks and months and years. So that's sort of interesting. So what's the bottom, like what do you tell people if they say my data, my HRV says I'm a red light, but I feel like a green light? Who's right? How do you have that conversation with an athlete?
Yeah, so I think I've gained a lot more experience in this in the past 2 years since I've started also coaching endurance athletes. And I see that often the question is, my data shows this. And the other part that you mentioned, like, but I feel like this, is not even there. So it's the data shows this. And then my first question is always, how do you feel, right? So that is, I think, the most important piece of information that sometimes is not even apparent, right? Because, of course, if you just look at the tool doesn't know, but then the objective data doesn't know, but you need to talk to the person, right? You need to get that sort of input. So typically, I think the people that work with me, I'm obviously lucky that they have read about the things I wrote. So a lot of the explaining has already been done in the blog, and it becomes easier. But I try to stress these points that we discussed. So the fact that, a low day can happen because of many different things, and it does not impact our ability to perform the session. At the same time, we don't want to get in a situation of chronic negative response to stress. So how do you feel? The most important thing, because if you feel poorly, then the data is just reflecting something that is off. Maybe you're really getting sick or something like that. So in that case, we might take action, right? But if you feel good, typically I say, hey, if you feel good, we do the session and we see what happens. Meaning that typically, if it was nothing, the day after, everything is normal. And then it means that, there was no need to make changes. So I always give it 2 or 3 days if the person feels good, and we see if everything normalizes, which happens basically every time, unless, there is really something stronger happening. And of course, sometimes can happen, but it is, again, rare. If the person also feels good, for 2 or 3 days, it's difficult that you develop something negative. And then, I start from there, from that question, and then we try not to be overly reactive and really use the data in certain situations in which then we have a couple of bad days. And typically, I would say maybe every single time is life happening more than training, right? So I think that's where the data is useful, even though many people say, okay, I want to use this tool to really guide my training. But what the tool does, so what an HRV measurement reflects, is just overall stress. And training is typically, I plan it in a way that, it should not end up, in a hole, right? So there's stress is applied in a way in which I think is what you can handle right now, depending on your history and everything in your life, right? So it's very unlikely that we do some sessions and we see that reduction in HRV after the session. Typically, I would think that there we did something that maybe we're not ready to handle. So again, unlikely to happen. But then, people travel, or their kids are getting sick, or there's, all sort of, seasonal allergies, like
all kinds of
sort of
stress.
things, right? Exactly. So we are all exposed to all sorts of stressors all the time. And that's why the data is useful, I think, because it gives us context also in terms of all these things that are happening and where we might not really be aware sometimes as coaches, even if we talk to our athletes, so much happens in everybody's life that if we see something, maybe it's just an excuse to start the conversation, right? It's like, hey, the data's been low 2 days. What do you think is up? And maybe, they tell me, hey, yes, my family has been sick for a week. Like, oh, okay. So maybe we need to think about that.
There it
Um,
is. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So, and it's not always so straightforward, but in general, I think that's a good way to go about it. So you look at the data, you have a conversation and you see what other stressors are present and try not to be overly reactive, but then still pay attention here and there to also make sure we don't get, the situation in which we are always in a negative physiological response, so to speak, which is unlikely to help us long term.
Maybe we should have done this earlier, but can you explain to me and the audience what exactly HRV is measuring and how it does it?
Yeah, for sure. So when we measure HRV, we look at the variability between heartbeats because the heart does not beat at a constant frequency. There is always some variation, and this variation is not random, but is actually due, again, when measured at the right time. So in the morning or in the night, it is due to the activity of the autonomic nervous system. And the nervous system is basically modulating heart rhythm and therefore heart rate and heart rate variability in response to stress. So we face a stressor, again, any stressor as we just mentioned, and then we have a physiological response, like from a hormonal point of view as well, right? So our cortisol might rise, and there's all sort of things that are happening that we cannot easily measure. So it's not that it's less relevant to look at hormones with respect to heart rate variability. It's just that it's not easy. While
Mm.
the response of the nervous system, and in particular the parasympathetic branch, the one that is more active in a state of rest and relaxation, impacts heart rhythm, so makes variability higher when there is higher parasympathetic activity. So a higher recovery or rest state typically makes variability a bit higher, and the stress makes it lower, while heart rate is the opposite, right? I think to that people can easily relate. When they are stressed, they feel their heart is racing, and that is actually happening. Heart rate is higher and variability is reduced. So all of that is driven by the nervous system. And when we take this heart rate variability measurement, in practice, is just an indirect measure of our stress response. I think there also the key again is the response, right? It's not the stress per se.
Right.
So if we respond well
Right.
to stress, then our variability will be back to normal after maybe an acute suppression that is normal. But again, we measure, 24 hours later in the morning or in the night, everything is renormalized again after our training or all other stressors because we responded well, even if there was high stress. So good variability doesn't mean no stress. It means good response. And then if we cannot renormalize, right, within 24 hours, typically something is off.
And what is it? How does it actually physically the measurement made? I mean, we all think of in the old days when people would put the probes on the chest, like an EKG type machine, and now it's done in a ring or with the phone camera or some sort of device, a Whoop band. How is that working, and how direct is that measurement?
Yeah, that's also a great question because in reality, heart rate variability is the variability of heart rhythm, and that can only be measured with an electrocardiogram. So right now, the most easy to use electrocardiogram is not anymore gel electrodes and things like that, but it still is a chest strap, right? So like a polar chest strap works great for a heart rate variability analysis. So you would put that on and take your measurement in the morning. Then, of course, this is also sometimes not the most convenient way, or at least since the development of optical technology, like what you have in the rings, in the watches, or in our app with the phone camera. That means that you're looking at change at the periphery. So again, not at the heart, but you're looking at blood volume changes, for example, at the finger, because of course the heart beats and blood flows. So at the periphery, you can look at changes. This is typically very highly correlated, which means that on a day-to-day basis for a person, the data follows basically the same trend when you measure
Okay.
it these two different places. There can be small differences because, of course, by the time it reaches the periphery, there's other factors that impact blood flow, like blood pressure, for example. So there can be variations, and there's also, for some people, there could be larger variation than for other people. But in general, I think it's accepted that these methods can be very accurate, especially to capture relative changes over time, assuming, again, the device is being validated against ECG. Like, it's not that all optical sensors can do that. But even the chest straps, like not all chest straps can measure heart rate variability correctly. Like I have a bunch here
Hmm.
because, for work I test things and so on. But when I measure, I always use the polar one because I see that with the other ones, the data sometimes is more erratic. So even if they can give you heart rate correctly, does not mean it can give you heart rate variability correctly. So it's always important to use a device that at least has shown in some validation published that it's very close to an ECG. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Interesting. Yeah, I've personally and with my athletes experimented with the chest strap, and that was very intuitive to me. How that could, I think I was using a Garmin at the time. I was trying it with the actual chest strap, but w- I've wondered what that correlation is, and I haven't personally seen that data or those validations. And then, I knew that, your app uses a phone camera. I know that there's sort of based on the same optical technology that would be in like an Aura ring, and I assume that Whoop works the same way. Um, and I was never that confident in them. Is there a significant variation in the accuracy of the different optical methods that are measuring in the extremities, or are they all similar or the same?
So I would say they are very similar. At the end of the day, when you are asleep or when you take a measurement that is short, like with a phone camera in the morning, because in a situation in which there is very limited movement, because in theory, let's say the finger is a better place, right? That's because, you have closer access to the arteries, while in the wrist, the arteries are actually at the bottom and the sensor typically is at the top. And we all know from, exercising and running that wrist heart rate is typically the worst place where you can measure it. And now you have even the same technology, in armbands that you place, just maybe near the shoulder and just day and night, right? It works so much better. It's the same thing. So it's just the wrist is just a poor place to measure these kind of things. But when you sleep, that's different. Like you're not moving,
Right.
there's almost no artifacts. So even there, I think it's good. So in general, I would say these technologies can be used. At the same time, also with our app, like with the camera, the latest iPhones, for example, they put the flash and the camera very far. And that is a problem. Like to the point that myself, like since the new phones, I use the strap again, right? Because I used the camera
Okay.
for, a decade, always works great. But then the technology was, so the phone, let's say, could be hacked the correct way because the camera and the flash were like next to each other. And you need to use the flash to, again, illuminate the finger so that you can record the change in blood volume. But if the flash is very far, then you cannot do that well. So for me, it was simple matter of using the strap. But then, it's just to highlight that it's never so simple or it's never the same. Technology evolves and things like that. And with wearables, also the same. Like they decide the design, but at the same time, there's many considerations beyond HRV in what they are doing. And then there is a new generation of hardware, and maybe there is more sensors, and maybe the HRV piece becomes something, that again has trade-offs with respect to the new things that they mounted in there that they want to do. So everything needs to be validated sort of every iteration just to make sure we still collect good data.
Yeah, interesting. I want to ask you about the orthostatic stress, and I'll just tell you a little story. Like when I was training full time 20 years ago, and as a sort of professional athlete climber, we used to do orthostatic tests for our recovery. Like do like box step ups for example, get the heart rate up to a certain amount and then sit in always the same kind of position and measure how quickly the heart rate came down. And we used to use this also like on expeditions at base camp. It was sort of this incredible portable low tech way to measure recovery. And I felt like it worked pretty good. It, again, gave another data point. It felt more objective than just pure feeling, and it often aligned with pure feeling. So, can you talk to me about orthostatic stress and why body position matters I mean, we've talked about the time of day, but the position of the body, and that it's, I guess, similar between tests is important or is relevant, right?
Yeah, it's very important that we measure in the same position, and even that, if we can, we exploit really the orthostatic stressor, like basically the change in body position, right? So the test you were doing, and then looking at heart rate, I think is great. Now with HRV, I think the advantage is that it's a more sensitive measure of stress, so we don't need to do so much to see a change like we would do with heart rate, and where maybe we were looking at again heart rate recovery and things like that. So typically at rest with HRV, we can capture much of that change. But if we change body position, then of course we create basically, the body has to respond to that change, right? Even just in terms of blood volume and, pulling in the right places and things like that, because you don't want to faint every time you stand up, for example, right? So
Yeah.
those kind of changes make it so that if you measure shortly after, then the measurement is just more sensitive to stress because the response is amplified. So if I'm a bit sick and, not badly sick, just a bit sick, and then in the night, I'm still sleeping, having a decent night, and maybe my heart rate, instead of, 48 is 50. That change is so small that I cannot really see much into that. It's just day-to-day variability is within that. But then if I'm sit up in the morning, then instead of being, 51, it's 63. Like the change is really amplified by that change in body
Okay.
position on the same day. Like, and I have collected also this type of data, like to show the importance of, the orthostatic test and changing body position and so on. So that's why I'm saying it's a good thing to do. It's simple. If you're already taking your morning measurement, just do it sitting up. And then typically the data is a bit more useful. And that is all there is, I think, in terms of the orthostatic stressor, because HRV is more sensitive than heart rate already. So we don't need, to do maybe a measurement before changing position, a measurement after. That was also done in the past, or maybe a more complex test, a bit like you were doing as well. I think we can still keep it simple with a resting measurement, but after the change in body position, I think that is a better protocol. It was actually a study very recently, maybe last year, with people going at altitude, and you could not see a change, even going at altitude, in their night data. So night HRV was the same. But then they measured also in the morning standing up, and it was a huge change with respect to sea level. So it's just
Okay.
easier to capture it that way. And then I would assume, if you keep measuring and you stay at altitude and you adapt, then, that difference with sea level would narrow down, while again, in night data would always be the same. So sometimes it's very convenient to use wearables, but it doesn't mean that you're collecting useful data.
Yeah, I want to come back to altitude in a little bit because I think that's going to be super interesting for our audience. But I want to kind of drill into people that HRV reflects a response to stress, not how hard you trained. And it's more how did you respond to the training. And you know that's something that a concept that I am constantly explaining to athletes, that is, I think, counterintuitive when people haven't been training much before, that they think, we've watched too many Rocky films and seen too much of this like macho version of training. And real training is much more subtle and much more about signal and response. Um, and I think HRV is aligned with that. It's a response to the stress. Is that, would you
Yeah,
amend
yeah.
or edit anything in that statement?
I think that's great. It reminds me actually of how some people think that when they train or train hard, they should see a suppression in HRV the day after. Like if they don't, they think they didn't train hard enough. But that is absolutely incorrect. Like if you see a suppression, you just went way beyond your capacity to assimilate that stimulus. And that means typically that, it's not gonna help you get better. And in fact, like the best athletes, elite athletes that definitely train a lot, high volume and very hard, have the most stable data. Like there is very, very few suppressions, and it's hardly ever about training. Again, maybe it's travel if they are competing somewhere else, or again, all sort of things that happen in everybody's life. But the response to training, actually, the better you are, the fitter you are, the quicker you rebound to your normal, right? Which is also why, as a good athlete, you can take more training, or maybe you can train twice per
Yep.
day. It's just you're
Yep.
not training in that depleted state or in that overly stressed state, or before you bounce back to normal, to homeostasis. Like you just bounce back very fast. And so typically, even if you train very hard and the day after your HRV is normal, that is a very good signal. It means, you could take that training.
You're absorbing the training well. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And, we've, yeah, 100% agree with that. I want to, when we've talked about stress and HRV, the illness has come up a bunch of times. In some of the writing that I've read of yours, you've been very precise about the differences between detecting, not predicting illness. Can you explain that to us a little bit?
Yeah, I think that was part of peak hype HRV during the pandemic, or those times where, like tools tracking HRV, and, there was always this statement that HRV would predict illness. I mean, for sure, there are situations in which your body is already sick and you haven't developed symptoms yet. So you haven't not noticed yet. So there
Mhm.
is a case for the data sort of showing something that you have not realized yet, even
Mhm.
though, of course, that is something that is already happening in your body, right? It's not that, we're predicting the future, right? Because then sometimes that's really what people think. So we maybe have not developed symptoms yet, and you might already see it in the data to a certain extent. Even though I think in under most circumstances, typically the data is simply reflecting what we also feel. Like we feel down, you're getting sick, and you also see it in the data, like the two come together. That is not
Mhm.
very
Mhm.
different from training. Um, so I think in general, maybe for some people it helps them pay attention a bit more, or some cases in which you are a bit more uncertain about, how you feel. That is also the use in training again for objective data. Is, as you also mentioned during your expeditions as an athlete, like you do the test to have one extra data point, because even when you're in tune with your body and, feel is what drives your decisions, still it's not black and white every day. So sometimes you're pushing your limit and, you just have another data point to consider. So I think in that context, it can be useful. But, the data typically can only reflect what is already happening in the body. So it could also be that if you pay attention a little more, you realize you already have some symptoms that maybe you were ignoring.
Yeah, 100%. I love that distinction. And I want to go back to connect back to what we were talking about a minute ago with how as athletes get fitter, their suppressions are less. And people, I've had athletes that expect their HRV to climb as their fitness improves, but that's usually not what happens. And I think we need to understand this idea of parasympathetic saturation to explain why super fit people sometimes their HRV just sort of looks stagnant. And another, variable that I learned about from reading your work is a coefficient of variation as another metric. Can you kind of put these? I mean, we're going to get into some sort of technical terrain here, but I know there's a good chunk of our audience loves this stuff. So can you help define these terms that crop up and how to help us see what?
Yeah, for sure. So in terms of our absolute HRV, so the value of our HRV, not related to how it changes over time with respect to our history, but just the number. I think maybe we can start there because there's some misconceptions about, higher values always being better, or better athletes having higher HRVs. So I think none of that is true. So higher values, abnormally high for you. So again, you have a normal range like you have for your, for blood glucose or blood pressure. There's also for HRV, but unlike blood glucose and blood pressure, the normal range is not population derived, it's actually only your own. And that is because the genetic component of HRV is maybe predominant even in terms of this absolute value. So it wouldn't make sense, even if I take, I'm a male and I am 42 years old, even if I take only people like me and that even train like me or, and are from this area of the world and so on, still the HRV will be all over the place to the point that I cannot build a frame of reference for my own data using even people like me. So the only way to have a frame of reference is to collect my own data for, let's say, a month, ideally 2, and then we build this normal range. Now, when your data is above this normal range, so that's particularly high, abnormally high, that could be also that the body is in a state in which is not very recovered, so to speak, but is working hard to recover. So maybe it's too parasympathetic in a way. And typically that comes also with heart rate quite suppressed. And I think people that coach or train are familiar with heart rate being suppressed during a run, for example, that, is not a sign that you suddenly got extremely fit, right? It's typically a sign that you're fatigued. So
Yeah. Yeah, you can't get your heart rate up as
yeah,
like you expected. And athletes ask us all the time, like, why couldn't I get my heart rate up yesterday? And the answer is one, they don't like to hear. So they're
yeah,
probably too fatigued for that workload.
yeah, yeah, exactly. So for resting physiology, we can think similarly sometimes. So if there is an acute change where heart rate is quite suppressed and HRV is quite high, then it could be that, again, it cannot be interpreted as many wearables do, which is higher is better. So go out and go very hard. So that is another misconception I think is important to remember. It's much better to be within your normal range than to be with particularly high value, because that could mean, again, there is just more fatigue. So that is one side of things. And given that there is a strong genetic component, again, you might be a very good athlete and your heart rate, typically resting heart rate, tends to be quite low. So there is a much stronger link between your cardiorespiratory fitness and resting heart rate than there is with HRV. So your HRV could still be, with respect to the population, not particularly high. And you would use the data in the same way, relative changes with respect to your normal, how that goes. But it's not that you need to have particularly high values. So I think that's just important to know, because people expect maybe that, the HRV should be higher for fitter people, or that as they get fitter, it gets higher. I think I think much of the change in HRV as they get fitter, if they were beginners before, maybe so there is a dramatic change in fitness, then there can be some change in HRV, but that's typically also just a reflection of the fact that the resting heart rate is going to be lower. So there is more room for variability. So it is kind of accounted in large part by the change in heart rate. Now, the issue of parasympathetic saturation that you mentioned, I think is something also to keep in mind. In certain situations. So what does that mean? So parasympathetic situation means that basically HRV under certain circumstances does not track parasympathetic activity anymore very well, because even if parasympathetic activity increases, basically the receptors in the heart are saturated, meaning they cannot take anymore. It's like you have a glass of water, and then if the water level never reaches the top, then it tracks very well. But then if you reach the top, you can keep pouring water, but it stays there. Like you cannot measure more
Could not
water in
measure
that
more
glass.
than the size of the vessel.
Exactly. So it's the same in this case. And also there, I think typically we've seen that if you get people to measure while sitting or standing, you sort of remove this problem, meaning that it is more unlikely to see saturation. Again, if you use the orthostatic stressor to change position, so basically you stress a bit the body. Typically, of course, the HRV data, for example, even in absolute numbers, tends to be a bit lower when you're sitting or standing with respect to lying down. And so that is a simple trick, but maybe in night data it's not possible to do that. And so there could be a situation in which HRV does not change much, and that could be due to saturation. It's not really something that diagnoses. You cannot look at and see, if heart rate is, not changing with respect to the neurotransmitters that are modulating heart rhythm. So it's a bit of a sort of empiric way to look at things. Is your heart rate very low?
Okay.
Are you training at a very high volume? Are you measuring only in the night? Are we not seeing changes? Then it might be saturated.
Okay.
Now, the other thing you mentioned was the coefficient of variation. This is a bit of a different way to look at the data. Instead of looking at your weekly average or your daily scores, you look at how much your data is changing over a period of time, typically a week. So how much jumping around you have in a week. Because if your HRV is 100 milliseconds, the average of this week, obviously it could be that every day it was 100, or it could be that it was, 120, 80, and so on, right? So it jumps around more. This variability, right? So how much it jumps around is also reflective of your stress response in a way that typically, if your HRV is within your normal range, or let's say it's good, it's not particularly suppressed, then it is preferable for the coefficient of variation to be low, which means the data to jump around less. Because again, it's also quite intuitive, right? If you're training or there's another stressor and today is very suppressed, right? And then you recover tomorrow, you take an extra nap and, you eat well and so on, and then it jumps back up. And then you're again very stressed and again is suppressed. So there's a lot of jumping around, typically not a great thing. And this is also individual. So it's not that for every person, it's the same amount of jumping around. And that is also something to keep in mind. Never compare, with your friends' day-to-day variability. It's about how it's changing for you with respect to your historical data.
Is stability more important than magnitude
So
in
I
that
think
sense,
that,
or am I misunderstanding it?
Yeah, I think stability is really what we are after when we look at HRV. And for a very long time, it has been pushed the idea that higher is better. And I think we are finally getting to, more stable is better. It's not about HRV going up. It's about, being within that normal range, which means that you stress the body and then it bounces back. And when you measure again, it's again what it should be. So the stability of it, I think, is the optimal response more than an increase or anything else.
And the stability as it relates to you, and based on, and you kind of specify like a range of sort of, 6 to 8 weeks, or what did you say? 6 to 8 weeks or 4 to 8 weeks of data to kind of establish that.
Yeah, exactly. So in our app, we use 2 months, and in research, typically they are in a rush, so they use 1 month. But I think, anything between 1 and 2 months is acceptable.
The one thing I wanted to kind of ask you is if this, and I've asking for a friend, had this happen where their sleep is good, their nutrition is good, their stress is low, and the HRV is still trending down. Is that, in that case, still an early overtraining signal, or, and assuming this is relative to that person?
Yeah,
Is that
so
is that what it most likely means? And how do we know that that's the correlation?
yeah, not necessarily, maybe. What I mean is that, first of all, I think when we use this data, while useful, we also need to accept that we don't have all the answers. And sometimes there might be changes that we don't know exactly what is happening. But the one thing that we should keep in mind always, which of course you are very well aware of, given, all the work at altitude and so on, is our environment. But our environment sometimes means even just the seasons changing. So there's seasonality in our physiology. And I think that is something that we also need to keep in mind, because typically if we live in a place where seasons are quite
Interesting.
different in terms of how long is the day, the temperature, and again, yeah, just I would say mostly these daylights and temperatures, then those factors reflect in our resting physiology quite well. There's also studies showing this, where basically your resting heart rate tends to be lower in summer and higher in winter, and HRV is the other way around. So it's a bit lower in winter and higher in summer. So, if you see some changes that you cannot explain very well and are also quite chronic in a way, so it's not that it is suppressed a day or two, but it's kind of stays there for a week or two. It could be also these kind of changes in our environment or the seasons, and depending on where we live and so on. So sometimes it's kind of like, that's how it is. It's not really that if you cannot change your environment, then that's how it is. And what are the implications for training? I think maybe that's an open question. Like, I don't think we know that. Like, sure, there is a change in our physiology, and maybe that means that we really cannot assimilate the same amount of stress that we could assimilate, over summer. Maybe that is the case. Training certainly differs typically for people living in these different environments. So, the racing season is summer typically in the mountains, right? And then in winter, there's a lot of base training maybe, and different kind of like less intensity or smaller bits of intensity. Depends, of course. But still, it could be that something there is also driven by these changes and not necessarily something as related to training or negative in the response of the person. Yeah, I would say again, we don't always have an answer, but we also need to keep in mind that it's not only the factors that we can control, it's also where we are placed as people, and how that impacts us.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Well, that bridges to one of the other kind of seasonalities I wanted to ask you about. Uh, Half of our athletes are female, and a lot of them are flagged as stressed for 10 days a month simply because they're in the luteal phase of their cycle. Physiologically, what happens to HRV during this phase of a woman's cycle? And as a coach or as an athlete, how should I think about adjusting their baseline so we're not giving them false rest days based on that feedback?
Yeah, so I think so I'll tell you first what at the population level can be seen in the data. But then we talk about the individual, because that changes everything. That would be the advice, for example. So let's say that at very broadly speaking, at the population level, we see that the physiology in terms of resting heart rate and HRV tracks similarly to changes that we see also in temperature, which is of course due to hormonal changes during the cycle. So in the second phase of the cycle, the luteal phase, typically there is a reduced HRV and slightly higher heart rate. And that is what we can see at the population level. But then I think, just like in many other things, physiology and training related, the individual variability is higher than the variability between groups, even groups of similar people. So the individual variability is so high that between two people that have the menstrual cycle, we could have very different responses in the resting physiology data. But even the same person across cycles over time can see different patterns, because the symptoms might be bit different. The other stressors that are present are of course different. We are not, static. And, again, the seasons are changing, our training is changing, our other stressors are changing. So everything changes at the same time. So it's very difficult, I think, to have expectations on the data or to see in the data what we see at the population level. And then there was a study just, I think, out this week, also looking again at HRV and other parameters in different phases of the cycle, but then looking also at performance outcomes in athletes. And so
Okay.
they could show that in different phases, the physiology was different, again, as we discussed now, but then the performance was not. So again, the change in physiology doesn't necessarily mean that the athlete will perform differently, better or worse. Like they could perform the same in the different phases. So I think that is also important to know, because the person might have symptoms, and of course those need to be accounted. But we, at the same time, you can never be sure that you are in a certain phase and the athlete feels good. Like performance might be as good. Like it's not necessarily worse, so to speak, because in that phase we know that typically HRV is a bit lower. Some other physiological parameters are more indicative of a more stressed state. And
Yeah.
again, maybe we don't know what that means in terms of assimilating the training, right? As we discussed at the beginning. So it could be there are other implications, but in the studies looking at performance, then at the moment there are no strong changes that would, I think, make a coach decide that things should be modulated that way. I think it's better at that point really to work with the individual and their feedback and how they feel they can execute the training and things like that, and go really at an individual basis more than with what we expect from what we see at the group level.
Yeah. And it's one of the points that was made in one of our coaching discussions was that one of the coaches mentioned that it brought up that the HRVs flagging a negative when neither he nor the athlete expected it brought up him asking the question to his female athlete, like, where are you in your menstrual cycle? And then found out, like, and sort of solved the problem, and then brought that to the surface of their conversation more. And he was able to do a better job of his coaching just because he was more aware of where she was. And like you said, I think that the problem has been what I want to say, like uh, false negatives, or where we have training plan, but it's signaling, no, you shouldn't train today because your HRV says so. And so I think it's, if nothing else, it's like elevating this more into the consciousness of our decision making and making us more aware of it. So I think that's great, and I think it's really interesting, and I'm really grateful that there's more research coming out, because this is something up until, like, honestly, like just a few years ago, I wasn't really tuned into or thinking about. So it's new for me as a coach too.
Yeah, I think in any case, it's key context. So for some people, and then it's important to use it, as you just mentioned, it could explain a change in the data that you otherwise might think is due to something else. So if anything, is context that is important that is there, and then it can help, the day to day.
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. So shifting to another variable that a lot of our athletes manage, and we touched on it briefly, is altitude. Our our athlete group goes sometimes to, almost 9,000 meters in altitude without supplemental oxygen. Most of the time they're using supplemental oxygen, but very, very high, climbing very, very high. And a lot of trail races these days, it's very common to see courses go over 3,000 meters now. Um, the acclimatization for these races and for these mountaineering objectives is very important. What is the expected HRV response to short term, like acute, I think would be the clinical term, but meaning in a short time frame, exposure to a new altitude? If someone is trying to acclimatize and they go from the valley and they go up and they try to sleep at 3,000 meters, for example, what would be the expected HRV response to that?
Yeah, so typically, I think studies looking at this have shown that we have a suppression, like we have an increased heart rate, or probably people feel like the increased breathing rate, right? So there's some things maybe they notice, others like HRV is not something we can really notice, but then you can measure that there is a change, and that the change seems also quite aligned with how high you go, right? So the higher, the stronger the suppression. I think what can be interesting there is that if you stay quite long, say in the order of some weeks, then you might see changes in the data that reflect that you are getting used to the environment. Um, I did a study during my master's in which we had a few athletes that went at altitude, and then we looked at how their HRV changed and their resting heart rate, and also this coefficient of variation we discussed, so how much it would jump around one day to the other. And then we put this in relation to what we could consider a marker of their adaptation, which was, for example, what's your heart rate at a given pace, right? So at sea level, you have a certain heart rate at a given pace. You go at altitude, heart rate at the same pace is much higher. But then, after a couple of weeks, it sort of renormalizes. Well, maybe never like sea level, depending how high you are, but it gets better. So we
Gets
could see
better. Yeah.
that the people that had a greater disruption in the first week in terms of their resting physiology, so their HRV would jump around more, their resting heart rate was higher, then we had the people that struggled more to adapt or respond according to this criteria of their heart rate renormalizing at altitude. So it remained basically elevated in a way that they never really adjusted to the altitude. So this to say that maybe also what happens in the first week could be telling something about how you will respond in the longer term. So if you have a great disruption, it's going to take you longer, or maybe it's just too high for you. While if you have a smaller disruption, maybe you're just handling it better, and then also your exercise data will renormalize a bit quicker.
Yeah, it's interesting. And, one a few observations from having spent a lot of time at high altitude is one is that there are people who respond to acclimatization well and acclimatize quickly, and others that just take longer. And even knowing myself and some of my climbing partners I came to know very well, I would know that some of them acclimated much faster, but I would catch up and we'd be equal after, say, 4 weeks or something. Um, and also that the body kind of learns generally to get better. People who frequently go to altitude,
Yeah.
especially 1 or 2 or 3 times a year, their body learns how to do that. If you're a mountain guide and living and born and raised in the Chamonix Valley and you've been climbing Mont Blanc every summer all your life, like your body learns how to acclimatize to 4,000, almost 800 meters, and that becomes very normal and very easy for it. But if you take that same person and take them to 8,000 meters, they may have a different response. Like that's another, like it's very altitude acclimatization, and the individuality of it is very interesting. But I think that this is also what you're saying, like this as a signal is very interesting, and I can see how that could be really useful to track that for people. Did your studies or did your research or other research on HRV dial in? Like, was there predictability in terms of the time to adaptation with HRV and correlated to how subjective acclimatization was, or was it just too individualized to come up with an average?
Yeah, so the study I did was as very small samples, so we could only see a difference between two groups of people, the ones that we called that could respond well and the others that couldn't. I'm not aware of studies using a similar approach in which you look at the data in the first days to try to come up with what will happen in the future. Also because typically studies are a bit short also on this. Maybe evidence from the field would be more useful.
How do you manage or accommodate the fact that sleep can be very fragmented at altitude? That's one of the things that moving to high altitude does. Are you just focusing more on that waking, um, sit upright and do the measurement then, and relying less on the uh, during sleep measurement?
Yeah, I would think that's another reason to measure in the morning, because then sleep is just another stressor, at positive or not, it will impact your state. While if you measure during, then, and maybe you're also awake a lot, then first of all, the movement for wearables would create artifacts, but then also the data would be somewhat less representative of what we are trying to capture. So in your, recovery state in a known situation context, because then it's quite different from the typical sleep. So in those cases, again, I think it's just a bit better to measure after sleep, or even if disrupted or anything like that. Yeah.
shift of topic, I want to think about the future of coaching. And internally, we're developing our own intelligence engine for athletes and coaches. We call her Maria. And her purpose is to help organize and analyze and prioritize the training data because we're just getting buried by training data these days, as you know. It's not meant to make decisions on its own. It's meant to surface patterns and help us know when to ask questions and how to ask better questions. If you're shaping the logic behind something like this, like how would you want HRV as a data point to be weighted relative to other data that we can collect with wearables and also relative to like the subjective feedback? Like you said at one point, you just ask your athlete, how do you feel? That's one of the most important questions in coaching, right? How would you weight these different things? And where would HRV be in the sort of priority list? Would it be number 1, number 3, number 10, top third? I don't know how to exactly quantify this, but how would that be for you?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of the signals that we have to capture our stress response, stress being training or anything else, we have HRV, resting heart rate, and then in the context of training, we can also look at heart rate during training. So that's what we have more than what would be best, right? As we were saying earlier, like at a hormonal level, so much happens and we have no clue. So we just cannot look at it. So in the context of objective data points, we can look at, I think it's a useful one. So it's one I would look at, it's one I look at with the athletes I coach. Um, but again, always to me, I mean, the subjective feel is always the first, right? So the reason also to use the data typically is also to aid that self-awareness process of getting a bit more in tune with ourselves, also with heart rate during training, right? So it's not that we need to follow this blindly. It's more about if we set a cap for what's an easy round for you, the idea is that we also start thinking about that. Like, how does your breathing feel? How everything feels subjectively as we set certain limits, maybe because we want to learn those things so that, at a certain point, any good athlete can train all the time without any heart rate. But maybe to get there, looking at the signals sometimes was helpful because, you develop that self-awareness through the data. And I think also resting heart rate and resting HIV can serve that purpose at times. So I think it's very important to have it always in the context of let's get better at using feel and subjectively understand how we feel and all of that and making these decisions, because eventually I think that should drive the very vast majority of the decisions. And then HRV is something we look at just to have that extra objective data point that still can pinpoint certain situations, but also sometimes can just give us confidence both as an athlete and as a coach. I think we are feeling good, the training is going good, but then, also the data reflects that everything is, again, within your normal range. So it's still a good signal to have. It's not there only to flag negatives, it's also there to show that the process is going, well according to plans, and there's a suppression here and there because life happens, but overall, we are not doing anything that is causing, again, a negative physiological response or anything like that. So from those points of view, so if I have a tool, that would integrate data from the athlete and the coach and so on, for me, it would be one of the data points to look at together with the subjective of the athlete, because then that is always key for the decision making.
One of the things that I think people have focused on, and I have inadvertently focused on it in our conversation, was like the signal about today's workout, or should I train today? The should I train today question, or should I modify my workout? But when I have that discussion with an athlete, of course I'm thinking about that day, but I'm also really thinking about it in the context of just sort of the training density of that week, or even the 3 weeks or the build cycle we're in, or is next week the recovery week and we just have like, 2 more hard workouts, and I was going to do the hard workout today. Maybe I'm going to shift it to tomorrow because I want to or her to feel, like those kinds of things. This kind of idea of chronic load accumulation, how is that something that we can utilize HRV in understanding where people are at? Like, especially like the classic is the 3-week build, 1-week recovery, right? Like as you build the volume in a training block for sort of 3 weeks and you're accumulating fatigue, and that's what you're trying to get the body to adapt to. Is there something that's connected to that concept that it shows up or is measurable through HRV or any of these?
I think not necessarily. So I think through my experience over many years, I think often is a bit more of a lagging indicator. So that will mean that see that things suppressed in HRV and we are going down and so on. Typically, we already messed up when that happens. It's not that we sit a bit before and we manipulate training. So that's why I think HRV can only be used as a support system to a well thought out training plan. And it can never be training based on HRV, meaning without a plan. Because people also think that's the case. Like, especially if they get a wearable or something like that, they would go hard basically every day or any time that the wearable says so. And then when things are not going well anymore, then it's time to rest. But that, of course, is not how you train. But it needs to be said because that's how some people approach the tool. So the tool can only be used to make adjustments to a good training plan, I think. And in that context, it's useful. So sometimes, just to manipulate what is your capacity to stimulate stress on that given day, maybe it's not great. And then we push something another day. But it's more about small adjustments more than the overall structure or long-term changes. So even if training goes very well, in certain situations, we might see that you're always within your normal range and maybe there's a trend in the data that goes higher, but then it's difficult to, like, you still need to deload at a certain point. I think the data will not tell you that. So you need to do it before you see it in the data. So from that point of view, I think as a coach, still you need to start from your tools and your thinking of the athlete and their planning and so on, and then use HRV as a feedback, day-to-day feedback or short-term feedback. But it's not always so tightly coupled to what is happening at the higher level, or it just lags a bit in terms of showing certain types of changes.
Yeah, that's that, and that aligns with my experience precisely. So it's really good. I mean, because I'm not an expert in this, I was wondering if I was missing something, to be honest. So it's good to get that confirmation from you. So one final question: if you could design one physiological metric to measure that doesn't currently exist, or maybe is in its infancy somewhere, a true sensor for human performance, what would it measure? What would it be? What is your dream measurement that you would like to have as a coach?
Great question. I don't know, maybe I never even thought of something that we cannot measure, but I would like to see more of the things that happen in the body that we know that are happening, like we were discussing earlier at a hormonal level. Like, I'd be so curious to see what is happening, even just outside of stress hormones and cortisol and so on, but even related to training and how those things change in relation, I would say, because a lot is done acutely. Like, okay, you do a work, for this type of workout, this type of intensity, this is what happens. This has been done in the lab. But again, what happens long term? What happens over a training cycle where we stress this specific capacity? Or what is our capacity to assimilate stress at a given point? And is there anything in the body actually that can reflect that? Because maybe we have the same, let's say, physiological makeup in different situations. And once we respond very well and improve, and the other time we don't. And why is that? Right? So it's a bit the art of coaching, but at the same time, makes me curious. Like, is there anything there we can look at that could predict how we will respond. Like, because even with HRV, there is some research, very little, that shows that, for example, when our HRV is chronically a bit higher, we might actually be able to assimilate more training. So even though HRV guided training is always about holding back when the HRV is suppressed. So it's more about, not doing something, reducing intensity and so on. But there is also some research that shows that when it's higher, actually you might be able to assimilate more. And of course, it's difficult, especially if we talk about running is a high impact sport. So you cannot just add a workout. You risk to break the person. It's not just about the nervous system. Like, there's so much more that you need to be careful with. But maybe in a sport where there's less impact, or maybe in certain situations, you could do something with that information. And I think we know too little about that. So it's something I'd be intrigued to know more. As we
Yeah, I
know.
think the hormonal aspect would be my answer. I was thinking about what my answer would be, and not that you'd be interested, but I came up with the genetic response, like what on
Yeah.
our at the genome level, what is triggered, what signal, what is the genomic response of prolonged training, and how does that change? Because for sure, all of us that have done this for our whole lives or for a long period feel our bodies physically change, right? Like
Yeah.
something is happening at a very, very, very basic level that cause changes even at the morphology level. Like, I don't know, when I was climbing full time, I was so lean. I mean, I'm not now. I'm 55 and I don't climb full time, but I'm not. My body still sort of holds on to that, even though it doesn't have this demand on it placed on it anymore. And I think, I think that's entirely part of the process of having been climbing and training seriously for 25 years. And I don't know that. I mean, I'm an N of one, right? But I think that would be super interesting to know.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. For
we'll
sure.
develop the app to measure hormones with the phone and genome.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't know, some things maybe it's better not to know. If you know too much about genetics before working with a person, you might lose hope too soon sometimes. It is.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you so much for all your advice and expertise on this interesting topic. It's kind of a special place where it's this intersection of human physiology and science and technology. And I think that as technology feels like it's just going faster and faster and faster every day, it's a fascinating space to spend some time and think about and learn from an expert like yourself. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
One of the most common questions I get is, how should I get started with training? Well, they say the first step is the hardest, so let's make that easy. We are offering 3 4-week samples of our most popular training plans for mountaineering, trail running, climbing, and more. Go to uphillathlete.com/letsgo to sign up for our newsletter, and you will not only get monthly insights on training for uphill athletes, but you'll also get a sample training plan. It's totally free, so why wait? That's uphillathlete.com/LETSGO.